So it turned out that you folks got quite a kick out of seeing a load of old ports of Sega Arcade games to the ZX Spectrum. And hey, thanks for that. It's always nice when something from the old British micro that I enjoy so much gets people watching. Naturally, there were plenty of requests to follow up on this and look at Sega Arcade ports to other micro platforms, or indeed to look at how other companies like Capcom or Taito fared on the humble Specky. We'll definitely get to that, but for now, well, let's see how Sega Arcades came across on a platform that, in theory, should be more capable of handling a bunch of them. It's time for some Sega Arcades on the Amiga. Now, I did and a little bit about making this vid, actually, for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that there isn't a lot of different games here. With the exception of a couple of first-party Mega Drive to Amiga ones, all the games here are ones we saw in the Specky vid. In fact, there's a bit less. However, there's worth in looking at the quality of the 16-bit ports compared to the 8-bit ones, especially considering they're done by largely the same studios. You'll be surprised at what you'll find, and not necessarily in a good way. Yes, I have to say that you probably shouldn't expect the very best of the Amiga to be on show here. Some of the games in the last vid definitely got the most out of the Specky, while very few of these games get the most out of the Amiga. All of these games are for the bog standard A500, there's no A1200 Arga goodness here. A lot of them could derisively be classed as Atari ST ports, meaning it's the same game that you got on the ST, only with different music. And while this doesn't automatically mean a bad game, it means that they don't do much with any of the Amiga's hardware advantages. And much like the Spectrum, these games dry up after around early 1992. Don't expect to see anything later than G-Loc. Why is that? Well, we'll get to that in the end, when we also look at the possibility of a very big game indeed coming to the Amiga and the other micros. Could we have seen a certain spiky blue hedgehog on the computers? We'll find out. For now, well, let's go through these things. I think the best way to go about things this time, rather than the chronological way, is to do more comparisons. Some games here are better than the 8-bit versions, and others are a lot worse, including ones that were amongst the best Specky Sega ports. Here, however, to kick things off, is a little summary of the games that have pretty much remained the same. Aside from obvious graphical differences, they're about as enjoyable, or unenjoyable, as the Spectrum titles. Alien Storm here? It's just as terrible as it is on the Spectrum. I don't know what it is about this game that caused US Gold to put out such rubbish titles that are so completely unresponsive, but this Amiga version has much the same problems as the Specky one had. It's like you have no say on whether your character actually bloody does anything, and it makes for a painfully slow game. Alien Storm should be fast and fun, full of blasting and B-movie kookiness. This is like calling for a muddy field. Utter rubbish. Another one that continues being an abject stinker? Good old ESWAT, an utter misery once again. Actually, it kind of looks the same as the Specky version with the same really quite awful sprites, only they've been coloured in this time. It's one of the worst Specky ports, it's one of the worst Amiga ones, and I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be utterly friggin' dreadful on the C64, Amstrad and ST too. And as I kind of already alluded to in the Specky version, and as I kind of already alluded to in the Spectrum video, the Amiga version of Thunderblade is just as jerky, uncontrollable, and flat out hideous as its monochrome brethren. Pepsi sure picked a good title to stick their brand on with this one, didn't they? Those three are abject miseries, of course. This little lot here is slightly better, thankfully. Altered Beast's music isn't quite as rocking as the Specky ones, and it is still rather jerky, but this is countered by being a fair bit more playable. In the end though, it's about the same. The Specky version at least shines more in the graphics department. G-Loc is probably a little bit more enjoyable on the whole than it is on the Spectrum, but it's still just rather bare. And again, I should note that it is still called G-Loc R360 here, and that's still quite hilarious. I mean, come off it. And then you have the rather generic shoot-'em-ups, Scramble Spirits and Sonic Boom. They weren't exactly bad games on the Spectrum, and they're not exactly bad here. I mean, they're not amazing and you probably won't remember them for too long after playing, but they're acceptable. I suppose you could say the exact same thing about the original arcades. The other game I want to mention here, a bigger game, is Outrun. I decided to put this in the about the same section because, much like the Spectrum, the Amiga version of this game was given a lot of attention, was most certainly hyped, and yes, it was a big disappointment. You start playing it and, well, it's got the colours and all that, but it is just so jerky. It's the old ST port hoodoo once again, I'm afraid. It does at least have that incredibly weird and over-dramatic intro, mind you. The one that GameSack had a lot of fun with.
US Gold present from Sega.
Why did they put this into the game? No idea. Doesn't exactly fit, does it? This port is especially grating because, well, there's some really freaking good racing games on the Amiga. Some of the best you could get at the time. Let's do a bit of comparison. This game was released in 1988. Elite's tremendous and outrageously fun conversion of Buggy Boy, released in the same year. Jeff Crammond's seminal Stunt Car Racer, 1989. Now those two aren't necessarily like Outrun, but if you want something that is, well, look no further than the immortal Lotus series, the first of which hit in 1990. So, yeah, with this in mind, the Outrun Amiga is a bit of a bloody joke, really. As it goes, the racing games are going to be some of the more interesting ones here, mainly because you have options to control them with the mouse, and indeed that's normally the main option. Driving games with the mouse? Yeah. Seems weird now, but then computer mice back in those days weren't quite as sensitive as the ones we have today. The good old days of a big old ball rattling away in your mouse that you had to clean the pads on often, and had a tendency to come flying out and land in the deep abyss under your desk. No, nobody misses them, do they? Anyway, the mouse driving controls are going to be a bit of a mixed bag. Outrun here isn't the best, as you might expect, although it's not the worst that we're going to see either. Right, let's properly get into it. Here's the Amiga ports that are significantly worse than the Spectrum ones. And yeah, some of them have fallen pretty damn far. Why not start with the game that I reckoned was the best of all the Spectrum ports? Power Drift was an absolute belter. It ran great, controlled very well, and was basically everything you could possibly want from an 8-bit version of the game, especially on the Spectrum. I had a little look at the C64 version, and you know what? That's an absolute blinder too. You'd have thought that this game would be way too much for the 8-bits, but no, they got some wonderful little versions of it. Now with this in mind, surely the power of the Amiga's gonna make this even better, right? It'll be better, right? Yes, the worried face of Padme may well flash before your eyes. This port is a complete bloody disaster. Everything about the exceptional 8-bit ports is completely lost here. The jerky movement is beyond the pale. The graphics often interfere with the screen itself, making it very hard to see where you're going, and the courses themselves look so awful that it's really tough just to even follow them. And the controls, whether you go with a mouse or a joystick, it's so twitchy and haywire. Combine this with the narrow tracks and you've got a game that's just about unplayable. Oh, and the music's dreadful here too. Just horrifying to look at, even worse to play. So the story goes, this version was ported off of an NTSC Atari ST. It went from there to a PAL Amiga with almost no care or attention, and this is the result. It's not just one of the worst ports of this video, It's one of the worst Amiga ports I have ever seen. Alas, Time Scanner has dropped down a fair bit. This isn't the absolute drizzling turds like Power Drift, but yeah, this one's perhaps more a case of context. On the Spectrum, this was one of the best pinball games around, if not the best. But this is the Amiga, and much like WCW, it's where the big boys play. Some of the best pinball games ever were released for this system. And yeah, it almost seems unfair to compare this to something like Pinball Dreams, but alas, I can't help it. A rather simple pinball game with pretty wonky ball physics like this one can't hope to amount to much on the Amiga, I'm afraid. Action Fighter is another one too. What's pretty good on the Speccy is just really quite janky and choppy on the Amiga, and the faster speed actually makes the game even more of a pain in the arse to play than it normally is. Core Design handled this 16-bit version, much like they did with the 8-bit one, and it's not one of their best. Happily, they do have something better to show off in this video later on. Galaxy Force. It was a miracle that we got such a good version of this on the Speccy. The Amiga version is more in line of what you might expect out of a port of this, being another messy affair. It certainly controls a lot worse, the turns are a complete nightmare to deal with, but the main problem is the atrocious graphics. Power Drift is perhaps an even better example of this, but in both instances, while the 8-bit graphics may not have much colour, they're really nice and clean. These 16-bit graphics have more colour, but they're a mess that actively diminishes your ability to play the bloody thing. Beyond somewhat deceptive screenshots from the magazines, I would hope that it's quite clear which one's better in the visual department. If you think it's the Amiga, you're just bloody wrong, I'm sorry. We have other ports that seem to get fundamentals of the game wrong. I'm really not sure what happened to Crackdown. The Speccy port of this wasn't particularly good either, but the 16-bit one is worse even beyond not having an awesome 10-minute title song. They meddled with the game, zooming it way in. The small sprites are the whole bloody point of this game, allowing you to see a big chunk of the map, see all the enemies, and plan accordingly. Now you can't even really see enemies until they're right on top of you, and to top that off, if you're vaguely close to them, you throw a kick that usually just misses instead of, you know, shooting them in the face. An utter stinker, quite frankly. And then we have Shinobi. Not bad at all on 8-bit, but here, again, it just gets things wrong. A lot of the enemies don't feel right at all, and this game is ferociously ugly. Quite possibly the worst looking port in the whole video. I'm going to be pretty picky here as Shinobi is one of my favourite Sega games, but you can bet your bollocks to a barn dance that the Speccy version is far superior to this beige monstrosity. A lot of you marvelled at the Speccy port of Space Harrier, didn't you? How Keith Burkill managed to get such a playable version of the game into 48 kilobytes. It's quite an achievement. Unfortunately, most of the other ports fared pretty badly, including the Amiga one. It may look better graphically, but it just doesn't have the speed. Also, you control it using the mouse. Now you may have wondered if Space Harrier would work with a mouse, and I can tell you now that it absolutely does not. No matter how you set it up, it's way too freaking sensitive and you just end up crashing into everything. The Grand Slam port of Space Harrier 2 is a little better, and probably runs around the same as the Mega Drive version, but again, the mouse controls do ruin it. This game is not made for mouse control, at all. But you do at least get an option to play with a joystick for this one, mind you. Now as it goes, we're not quite done with Space Harrier yet. There's a little something else to look at, but we're going to save it for the selection of brand new ports and games for the end. I'll just say for now that it is by a long distance the most obscure entry in the series of Fantasy Zone related adventures. Passing Shot might have ended up in the about the same section, but I don't know, this one actually feels a lot worse. Passing Shot just isn't that good of a game to begin with, obviously. I bloody hate the top-down view of a tennis court and not being able to even see my frickin' player half the time, which automatically makes this a crap port. But the music also makes this dreadful. I mean, listen to this. Now, okay, I'm pretty sure this was some sort of bug related to whatever cracked version of the game that I played, and the game doesn't actually have this soundtrack. But it was still funny. Did your parents ever buy you a Casio keyboard in the hope that you'll be a natural at it and become a concert pianist at the age of 10 so they'll never have to work again? And then this is the sort of thing you start playing and they're all, "Ah, that's really good. Well done," while failing to hide the utterly crestfallen look on their faces? Well, that's what this bugged out soundtrack's like. Anyway, I digress. Whether this is the music for the game or not, and I am pretty sure it's not, it's still bloody rubbish. Lastly here, yeah, Turbo Outrun. No surprises here. The specky port of this actually wasn't too bad, feeling like a bit of a make-up for the poor quality of the original on the computer. Unfortunately, the game's ports generally stunk pretty harshly on most other platforms, and the Amiga one is quite risible indeed. It's another highly choppy experience, much like the Amiga port of the original, only this game has considerably worse music. Can I once again say that it's better than Teartex's hideous Mega Drive version? I suppose I can, but not by much. And of course, the Amiga got a version of US Gold's original and rather odd Outrun Europa. Happily, the game is now in colour that wasn't strangely locked away behind a poke at the very last minute. And the game itself isn't too bad, even if it really doesn't belong in the series. Judging by the screenshots of what US Gold had been cooking before they got the rights to Turbo Outrun, it would have been more similar to the original if this first version had been completed. Okay, that's just about the end of the bad stuff. I felt it was important to get through that first before progressing to the games that are decent. There's a solid 13 of them here in this section, and a few are very good ports indeed. So yes, happily this vid isn't all bloody dreadful drivel like Power Drift and what have you. Take Afterburner, for example. The Specky version was another very good Keith Burkill coded conversion, and so is the version on the Amiga. Well, depending on which version you play, anyway. Weirdly, there are two different versions of Afterburner, one released over here in Europe, and another in the States. Activision's version for Europe is definitely the inferior one. It's not bad, but it's definitely kneecapped due to running in a very tiny window, which is kind of silly for the Amiga to be honest, and feeling very bare despite having the speed and the music. Not the worst thing we've seen, but the American version is clearly superior. It might be a little bit slower, but it's full screen. It's got all the music too, and it's so much more busy. This just feels much more right. One thing that may be a pain these days is that the spacebar fires missiles rather than the joystick, but remember, back in the day you'd have the joystick on your desk, and you'd be controlling that with one hand, freeing the other one up for the keyboard. Get your brain out the gutter. It's definitely a better port anyway. Interestingly, the Activision port was done by Argonaut Games. Yes, the very same. This was their first project after breaking through with the Starglider titles, and it's not exactly the best game in their library. Needless to say, they would go on to better things. Much better things. Some of the worst ports on the Speccy do happily have much better efforts available for the Amiga. Here, for example, is Bonanza Brothers. It was nearly unplayable on the Spectrum, but this is just so much better even beyond the appearance of colour. It's actually easy to control, and jumping is immediately obvious. The incredibly catchy music obviously helps too, and it also helps that there's more than just the one song. I always find this game to be generally a little underrated, and the Amiga's gone ahead and done it a good bit of justice. Alien Syndrome is also much better on the Amiga. I mean, it actually controls like the bloody arcade for a start, and it has the all-important creepy music which is kind of necessary for this title. It is very difficult, especially because you actually have to rescue every hostage on a stage rather than just a few of them, which is different to the arcade, but it does play nicely. And Wonder Boy in Monsterland is thankfully given a decent treatment, one that's happily bereft of weird and clunky Mario-esque momentum movement. It's not amazing or anything, but it would still be a perfectly okay version of the game for somebody who, I don't know, didn't have a Master System. Hot Rod wasn't exactly a leading light in any way, shape or form, but it's pretty decent on the whole. I mean, it is just a simple top-down racer where you upgrade your car between tracks, but at least there's scrolling this time. Yeah, there's probably no reason why you would play this when games like Nitro or Supercars are readily available, but it's not offensive. Don't worry, there will be actual good games coming soon. Games like SDI. Another quite underrated Sega Arcade, and the Amiga version here does benefit from some nice mouse controls. They might take a teeny little bit of time to get used to, but they're actually not bad once you do, and the port does benefit from having some pretty decent music, for a change. And then there's World Championship Soccer. This was, of course, by far the worst port in the last video, a horrible mess crapped out by Canvas software that didn't even follow the basic rules of football. While the original game isn't good to begin with, the Amiga version is at the very least recognisable as football, and playable without having thoroughly stupid AI or the ability to just walk the bloody ball into the goal. Without Canvas's grubby hands getting onto it, you simply have a mediocre football game. Yay! Right, let's get down to some actually decent stuff. There are 6 Sega Arcade to Amiga ports specifically that, for my money, are pretty bloody good indeed, and well worth playing. And I'll run through them in reverse order of preference, a nice little countdown for the middle of the video. For a start, here's Super Monaco GP. Ugh, this is a much better racing game than anything we've seen so far. Look at how smooth it is. Look at how the graphics are actually decent for a change. It even kind of looks like the arcade, even if it is in a window. This is viciously rock hard, seeing as it still follows the one life and you're screwed formula of the 8-bit versions, but as a port, it's decent, and does a good line in racing. A good racing line. Anyway, in at number 5, how about Shadow Dancer? Not a bad port on the Speccy, despite the multi-load, but the Amiga version is very solid indeed. Not an awful lot unique about it, just a very good workman-like port of a nice arcade that doesn't miss anything, and gives you a decent slice of arcade action. Very likeable. For number 4, I've gone with Dynamite Ducks. Yes, this is Core Design's effort, and yes, it does indeed come with a very rude and smutty introduction hidden in the code. But we've also got a mighty fine version of the pretty cute little beat-em-up with a whole load of weapons kicking around on the disc. It's a little bit slow but still packed with enemies. One of those games that I think is quite overlooked in general, and this version here was definitely the best way for people to play it in the home. And at number 3, at last creative materials have a chance to shine. The specky port of Line of Fire wasn't too bad, although it was a little easy. This one here on the Amiga definitely feels more like the arcade. A proper rail shooter, played with the mouse, absolutely chock full of enemies. Now, sure, Line of Fire is basically a poor man's Operation Wolf. It is not a great game, but the quality of the port is good. Probably one of the best that Richard Applin ever did. It is fun if you like this sort of thing. Now, speaking of Richard Applin, he's got a funny developer message hidden in the code. He offers a little template for anyone busy creating a crack tro for the game, which I have recreated for you here to pause the video and enjoy a little. Even if some of his ports may be a little bit ropey, he certainly does have a good sense of humour. Okay, the top 2. Both are excellent ports, and it was tricky to choose between them, but in the end I've given the runner-up spot to Golden Axe. The specky port of this was a noble effort, really. A little bit of a mess on the gameplay front, but they did try. The Amiga port absolutely does the game justice though. A great beat 'em up indeed that runs exactly as it should, with most of the music from the arcade and basically nothing missing. While the Mega Drive version is obviously the best 16-bit one, this is most certainly the best from the micros. And hell, seeing as there's not an awful lot of decent beat-em-ups on the Amiga, in all honesty, it's probably one of the best on the whole platform. And then the number 1, well, of course, it's Super Hang-On. A belter of a port, one of the best arcade ones you'll find on the system, and a game where the mouse controls actually do work really frickin' well. In fact, there are some days where I might class this one as even better than the Mega Drive version. And it is indeed an ST port. The folks who had the Atari machine got much the same game too, only with an AY soundtrack. Excellent on every platform, this one. Well, except the C64. We don't talk about that version. But other than that, yep, the folks at Electric Dreams totally nailed this arcade. Top marks. Okay, we do have a couple of other games to look at, ones that weren't on the Specky, but were on the Amiga. I said earlier that we would return to Space Harrier's Fantasy Zone, and, well, here's Space Harrier Return to the Fantasy Zone, another game by Elite, another version of Space Harrier, meaning that it doesn't play very well at all. But what is it? Is it a port of something like Space Harrier 3D, or even a completely original game? Nope, it's the second half of the original Space Harrier. The first port on the Amiga only came with 9 of the original levels, way less even than the Spectrum version. Jeez, what a load of rubbish. It was seemingly made in around 1989, but it doesn't appear to have got a standalone release. It was only released in 1991 as part of a compilation called Finale that was one of the company's final releases for the Amiga. As such, this original Space Harrier game is very obscure and very rare, to the point where you usually won't even find it on any lists for the game. It's not exactly any good, but it is a bit of a curio for fans of the flying blonde-haired soldier and his journeys. The other two? Well, they're not all that much to speak of. We have kind of covered them before, but they're both ports of first-party Mega Drive titles. We have Tournament Golf, which is the Amiga version of Arnold Palmer Tournament Golf, but without the license, and thoroughly botched. It has much the same graphics, but it's considerably awful in execution with a power bar system that, frankly, doesn't seem to work at all. None of the cheerful and catchy music either. Awful, awful game, this one. And then we have Last Battle. Yes, a port of Sega's rather cheesy side-scrolling beat-em-up, the one that was originally based on Fist of the North Star. This is an odd case. The quality of the port itself is actually decent, really. It runs smooth, it's full screen, it's got the music, it's got everything you could want from Last Battle. Of course, the original game is pretty bloody pants to begin with, but someone must have got a kick out of it to make such an accurate port. You can also play this one on the Commodore 64, as it goes. Now, I assume that specky versions of both this and Tournament Golf must have been planned at some stage, but clearly they never got released or anything, and they stuck to the Commodore platforms. Both of these releases, as well as World Championship Soccer, are obscure. You won't find much in the way of reviews or coverage for any of them, but for the sake of completion, they ought to be here. Now, just to finish things off, it could be considered curious as to why, just like the ZX Spectrum, these ports completely stopped around early 1992. There was an obvious reason as to why they'd stop on the Spectrum. After all, the platform was coming to an end, but the Amiga had a good couple of years left at this point. However, once again, G-Loc was the last Sega Arcade port here. Now, the reason itself isn't actually that hard to figure out, but it does kind of relate to the possibility that a certain blue hedgehog might have made his way to the computers. Yes, there was a fleeting moment in time when Sonic the Hedgehog was scheduled to make his way to micros, to the Amiga, ST, C64, and possibly even the ZX Spectrum. It was mentioned in a couple of magazines, most notably CVG, and there's even a couple of screenshots. Very curious. These ports would have been handled, as you might have guessed, by US Gold. They were pretty much the only ones who were doing the Sega ports by 1991, after all, and you can expect that studios under their purview, such as Tiertex, would have gotten involved in these games, which were apparently planned to be released in the summer of 1992. Why did this not happen then? Why didn't we see the blue bullet on computers? Well, again, the reason isn't that hard to figure out, really. You might think it odd that we saw actual Mega Drive games on the Amiga and the like to begin with, in much the same way that it's odd to see a few Sega games make it to the NES or the PC Engine. It doesn't seem like the best idea to give games over to be ported to your competition, does it? And Sega eventually figured that one out. While there was certainly an agreement in place at one stage for Sonic to come to computers, the immediate huge success of the title, obviously being the game that really sent the Mega Drive into the stratosphere, made Sega cancel that agreement pretty bloody quickly, and it would seem that they changed tack everywhere else. Arcade ports and the like for Sega games would be on the Mega Drive only from that point. Which, well, it certainly makes a great deal more sense. How far along was the development of these ports before they all got cancelled? Probably not very far at all. Certainly no code has ever been leaked, and all that exists are those magazine screenshots. It is quite possible, and indeed probably likely, that those screenshots were simply mock-ups, meaning that there's nothing really out there to find. Who knows? For now, all we have of Sonic on the Amiga, at least from the time, is his rather strange and totally unofficial cameo in The Adventures of Quick and Silver, a game anonymously made by Kiko and released on the cover of the obscure and short-lived Amiga Fun magazine, about a month or so before the official release of Sonic on the Mega Drive. Yes, the microcomputer scene, it was a strange place indeed. And with that, well, we're about done here. That's a quick look at Sega's exploits on the Amiga, as executed through the likes of US Gold, Elite, and Activision. If there's interest in a look at how the C64 handled things, well, I'm sure I'll end up examining those too. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will say, as ever, bye for now.